Hi, welcome to my home. We're going to be taking a look today at Part K and Part P of the building regulations, the new approved documents, and we're waiting for Jeff Wilkinson, who's leading commentator, leading voice, and a well-known approved inspector, who's appeared on many of the programs for MBS in the past. He's going to come and explain some of the important issues arising from these two approved documents. Part K, which is about stairs and ramps, and P on electrical safety, have been reformatted, got a new look. They've also taken into consideration issues like plain English, so it should be much more easy to understand. And just take, for example, K. Some of those annoying conflicts between Part M, access, and K have been removed, and Part N, approved document N, has now been revoked and incorporated within this document. So Part N no longer exists. Also, safe to say that these documents now apply to England only. So if you're in Wales, you still have to use the existing approved documents. Anyway, I think that's Jeff coming now. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Austin. Good to see you, mate.
So, Jeff, before we go in and have a cup of tea, that's a staircase. We are looking at approved document K. So in the old document, many people will be surprised to know that they didn't have minimum widths, but this one does, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the general assumptions was that an approved document covered things as simple as staircase widths. Wasn't in there. In the new version, though, of course, it is. If you check through the details, you'll find it's 1200 clear width on the staircases.
But that's not for domestic dwellings.
It doesn't apply to domestic dwellings, although potentially it does to the access stairs in blocks of flats, that kind of thing. Certainly does in commercial buildings.
Cool. And the minimum width between handrails is 1 metre now then?
That's right. Obviously, as I said, minimum width is 1200 across the stairs. That's mirrored between the two strings, but you're allowed 100mm projection from each of the handrails on either side, giving you 1 metre clear.
And one of the final ones, there's lots of information to be talked about, but let's just deal with one more. The 2 metre wide staircases, instead of 1.8 having to be subdivided, now it's 2 metres wide. So what gains do we get there?
200mm to me and you, mate.
Yeah.
The benefit there is that you've gained that 200mm on it, but it really applies to large commercial buildings, assembly buildings, things of that kind. It's just a coordination of the dimensions.
Extra gains. Everyone's a winner. Look, it's been very inhospitable of me. Let's go have a cup of tea.
Okay, don't mind if I do.
Walk. Let's get that kettle on.
Great.
Jeff, yeah.
Oh, lovely.
No problem. So look, this approved document K, the green part, very helpfully, that's part of the actual building regulations.
Yep.
They seem to talk about absolute safety, whereas the approved document just talks about reasonable safety in staircase design. Yep. What's the difference?
Well, you're absolutely right that the parts that are reproduced in green are the regulations themselves, which are being copied and pasted effectively. And you're quite right to point out that there are a lot of occasions where either the approved document talks about reasonableness or adequateness, or the regulations do, and sometimes the two don't seem to tie up properly. What you need to be aware of is the status of the approved document itself and the reason why you're looking at those in the first place. The reason for that is that if you follow the guidance in the approved documents, you're effectively deemed to satisfy. So you don't then get tied up in what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. If you choose to follow an alternative path, then you can find that you've got issues over that.
All right, let's go and sit down.
Okay, let's go.
Right, Jeff, look, I've got Part K here, as it so happens. Just tell us a little bit about the main changes that we might find in that document.
Okay, well I think the first thing to do is to point out the new style and format to it, but in particular the fact that Part K now includes some of the bits that previously could be found in Part M and in Part N as well. So in fact there's no Part N approved document at all now.
Part N disappeared.
It's gone, so don't look for that. Okay, if you flick through the document itself, one of the most important tables to draw people's attention to is this one, table 1.1. If you have a look there, you'll see that the classifications themselves have changed. The good old-fashioned private stair that we're all familiar with is still there. But what we've now got is we've got two new categories. We've got the utility stair and the general access stair. If you take a look, the rises are fairly familiar to us. But if you take a look over here, you'll see that the goings are now 250 and 400. So some significant changes there, which just extend the kind of way in which the stairs can now be designed. Gives you a bit more flexibility than you previously had.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
New change. So what else is there that's new?
Well, perhaps worth another look as well is this one, diagram 2.1.
Very usefully, you turn to the right page there.
It is indeed.
Very good.
If you take a look at this one, 2.1, this sets out the same guidance that we had in the previous one, but in a much more accessible way. In fact, that's typical of what they've done throughout the documents as a whole. They've taken the former tabulated information and they've put it in something which, particularly for those that are not particularly familiar with it, it sets it out much more easily. Take a look at this one. Goings of ramps up to 10 metres, okay? Maximum gradient of the ramp 1 in 20. Okay, helpfully they've clarified exactly what their maximum rise therefore is going to be. So it's 500 mil. So 10 metre ramp, 1 in 20, 500
So
mil.
it's the same information.
Same information.
Better diagram.
Much better diagram, much more easy to use. 5 metre ramp, maximum 333 millimetre rise. 2 metre ramp, 1 in 12, 166 millimetres rise.
Let's put that to one side.
Okay.
Interesting and exciting though it is. Part P, electrical safety, and I raise this partly because you've just seen me with the kettle, but also the next door neighbour had a devastating fire because of overloading sockets. I know that's not part of the approved document, Part P itself, but tell us a little bit more about the fire safety provisions in the local acts, which came into force in January 2013, I believe.
Yeah, alongside all of the changes that are due to come in April, some have actually already taken place. One of these is the withdrawal of local acts, for example. Now, these local acts generally apply to fire safety provision. They often apply to buildings of excess height or cubes. So, block of flats, for example, would potentially be covered by this. And what they've done is they've removed some of these local act requirements, which has reduced the overall burden of legislation on developers, to a particular point that this is huge amounts of money in some cases. The provision of sprinklers to a 20-storey block of flats, for example, would have been a very significant amount of money. Those changes have already been brought in, and they've removed some of the anomalies. We're sat here over in Tottenham. If we were a few yards down the road in sunny Tower Hamlets, that's where Section 20 would previously apply. The same building, literally a mile or so apart, would have had different rules applied to it. That was some of the anomalies that occurred under local acts.
Right, so it's all a lot clearer now.
A lot clearer, already happened.
Okay, but in terms of sprinklers, I read recently that maybe Wales is going to be introducing sprinklers. Is that happening?
Yes, it is. So on the flip side, as we've simplified the removal of the local acts across the whole of England, we're now looking at the introduction of sprinklers into not high-rise buildings, but into low-rise, potentially domestic buildings in Wales. It's certainly on the agenda for the Welsh Assembly, and when they get round to amending their regs, we can look forward to that coming in.
Possibly.
Possibly.
Okay. Right. Coming on to Part P then. So the amount of notifiable work has changed, hasn't it? Why is that?
Again, it's all part of the government's agenda to reduce the burden of legislation on the domestic market and on the development industry as a whole. They've got a requirement that at least for every one rule that they bring in, there's at least one going out, and ideally 2 or even 3 rules that have actually been taken out. So Part P was one of those that they decided, when we actually look at the risks, the burdens that has introduced, is there a balance between that and the need to make applications?
So the approved document itself talks about low voltage and ultra low voltage, but what about 3-phase?
Under normal circumstances, 3-phase doesn't generally apply to domestic. Part P is only applying to domestic. But if you've got a 3-phase supply to a garage or an outbuilding or something of that kind, then yes, Part P would apply.
So if I'm not mistaken, there's going to be a lot more work for somebody like you, isn't there? Are you probably rubbing your hands with glee?
To be entirely honest, Austin, no. For most building control bodies, Part P is a fairly specialised part, and a lot of the building control bodies will actually outsource that work to a third party, usually a qualified electrician. Certainly, we will do some of the inspection during the course of the work, ensuring that the cables are running in the correct zones, that kind of thing. But when it comes to the actual testing, most approved inspectors, most local authorities are not themselves set up for doing that.
So there is more reliance on certification by third parties than in the previous regulations, aren't there?
One of the things that you're actually seeing is that the government are looking to de-legislate as far as possible and to increase the amount of self-certification that's actually into the marketplace. One of the things that they've introduced this time round as a change is that you could potentially do some of the work yourself, but get a Part P qualified electrician to sign that work off without going through the building control body itself.
Or a building inspector or approved inspector could sign it off?
Indeed,
Right.
as has always been the case.
Jeff, if you take a look at page 6 in the document there, it looks as if you're installing a shower, simply a shower, you have to apply for full building regs approval. Is that right?
Potentially you're going to have to make an application for building control approval. The key point I think that you need to be aware of is that a shower by its nature is going to be within one of the controlled zones. Should we take a look at the diagram and just have a run through where controlled zones actually are?
I thought you'd know that.
Why not? As you can see
Very
from...
nicely, you turned to the correct page.
Professional, mate. Professional. Seamless. If you take a look at diagram 2, this sets out the requirements themselves. So it's an area in or around the bathtub. It's the wet area. Okay. Clearly, when you actually have a bathtub, it's a zone 600 millimetres beyond, okay, and a working height of 2.25 metres. Okay, so anything being carried out within that zone would be part of that controlled zone. So therefore it's notifiable work and you need to make a building control application. Worth pointing out though, because obviously we're getting a lot more wet rooms these days rather than actually bathtubs and stuff. So in those cases you need to then apply a metre, 1200 millimetres zone either side of the shower head itself. And if, for example, you actually put the shower head at say 2.4 metres, okay, then it extends the zone up. So the zone, although it's shown neatly in this diagram, potentially could be different if you do it as a wet room.
All right, okay. Anything else in that document that you want to point out?
I think it's worth pointing out this one for a start. It helps to clarify which parts of buildings Part P actually applies to, and makes it quite clear when Part P can actually extend into a commercial scheme. So if we take a look at this again, if you're effectively separately metering the business unit, then Part P doesn't apply. But if the business unit is served through the same metered supply, so you've got a flat over a shop, for example, then Part P extends into the commercial property as well as the residential section. So that's worth looking at.
Very good. So anything on these two that architects regularly get wrong?
Surprisingly, quite a lot. If we go back to Part K, one of the most common problems that we find is that the headroom over a staircase, particularly in loft conversion, is forgotten about. Dimensions aren't taken correctly, and that really is critical to getting building control sign-off. There is a relaxation, as you know, in here, which permits a maximum of a 1.9 metre headroom over the centre of the staircase. But really you should be checking to make sure that you can get 2 metres wherever possible.
Yeah, correct. Okay, good. And then finally, just things that are in the pipeline. What should we be looking out for?
Well, I think one of the other important changes, there are perhaps 2 or 3 that I should point out. First of all, local authorities for the first time are now required to issue a completion certificate at the end of the project. So what's going to go alongside that, I'm sure, is a request for more information. Because they're going to want to make sure that everything's buttoned down in order to be able to get that final certificate out. So watch out for that one. Another issue that you're going to be looking out for is the fact that local authorities and the traditional method of notifying the local authority to come out and do the inspections has changed. Okay, from April there'll no longer be the standard sort of 9 statutory inspection stages: foundations, damp, drains, etc. And local authorities will now risk assess the project. Now, what that means is that from an architect's point of view, if you've actually got a full set of plans that have been approved and have got lots of detail in them, then it means the local authority should need to carry out less inspections during the course of the project. And that can have a knock-on effect now for the cost of the application as well. Conversely, if it's being done on a building notice, it's a contractor that they're not familiar with, then that should result in higher building control fees for those applicants.
Very good. So April 2013 we're talking about there. All right, thanks, Jeff. Very good, very useful. Hope the tea was to your liking. I'm afraid we have to stop there because there's a very interesting programme we're going to watch on electrical wiring.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Let's sit back and
Enjoy.
enjoy the show.
Why not?
I'm waiting for Jeff Wilkinson to turn up. We're going to be discussing these 2 new regulations, Part K and Part P. K on